project in January, and more information will be available on the rest of the rollout during the course of next year.
Thank you. We now move to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day. First Minister.
Engagements to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland.
Joanne Lamont.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, in 2007, the SNP pledged to ensure that children in primaries 1 to 3 would be in classes of 18 pupils or fewer. When asked if he could guarantee that would be achieved within one Parliament, in 2007, the First Minister told this chamber, "Yes, I can." Nearly 7 years on, is the First Minister closer or further away from reaching that goal than when he took office?
First Minister.
Well, if I remind Joanne Lamont, this Government was re-elected in 2011. There has been, as she probably knows, not just a financial crisis, of which the Labour Party had a very substantial hand in, but also pertinently a reduction of over £3 billion in the Scottish revenue budget. That has meant that public authorities, the central government, local authorities, sheltered from that reduction but nonetheless facing extreme financial pressure, have had to deal with that position. And in order to protect school-pupil ratios, we negotiated, as she is well aware, in 2010 with COSLA an agreement that that ratio should go to no more than 13.5 teachers per pupil. That has been held to by COSLA. So while we would like to see substantial improvements in teacher-pupil ratios, I think we should recognise, in fairness to local authorities, that the Lent for Bread for Scotland, that agreement in 2010 has been upheld in difficult financial circumstances.
Joanne Lamont.
So in summary, it wasn't me. Talk about being in government and actually doing what you're supposed to do, because, of course, on the question of pupil-teacher ratios are now worse than when Labour were in power. So even that defence doesn't help the First Minister. The answer is, of course, that 7 years on, the number and proportion of classes of 18 pupils or fewer has gone down, not up. Pupils in primaries 1 to 3 are now less likely to be in classes of 18 and fewer than when Alex-Salmond became First Minister. I thought Scotland was on pause. Now we find it is on rewind. The number of primary school pupils on the school roll has gone up since 2007. That would suggest that, just to keep pace, let alone meet his own targets, for the First Minister to be serious about his pledges, the number of primary school teachers must have increased. So can the First Minister tell us how many more primary school teachers have been hired since he came to office?
First Minister.
Well, can I correct Joanne Lamont? This Government came to power in 2007. So let's compare with when Labour were in power in 2006. Well, the number of pupils in primary 1 to 3 in class size 18 is down. It's better than the 2006 figure. I mean, you know, I think Joanne Lamont should at least accept that the Labour Party were in power in 2006 and the SNP were in power in 2007. Of course, that's rather pertinent, since one of the first acts of the SNP government coming to power, and I remember Fiona Hislop making the announcement, was to increase the teacher training numbers by 300. And of course that applies, and let's look at these figures in detail, across primary. In 2006, the average class size was 23.1 in primary 1. It's now 21.2. In primary 1 to 3, it was 23.6. It's now 23.2. Now, I accept and agree that these are not the improvements that we would have been looking for if we'd had different financial circumstances over the last few years. But nonetheless, I think, given I've given her the figures, she can accept that there have been improvements in these primary categorisations since 2006. And I do think we can reach agreement that in 2006, Joanne Lamont was a minister in a Labour government, and in 2007, I was the First Minister in an SNP government.
Joanne Lamont.
And our figures in primary school education were better before he came into power than they are now. Well, that sounds like one of those answers that prove the world is not round in order to get the First Minister through the next half an hour. But at some point, he needs to come back to the real world, where parents, teachers and children are. Because the reality is, it would appear the First Minister didn't even believe in his own education policy. It was simply grist to the mill to change people's votes, not to change the lives of our children and their educational opportunities. Because, in fact, that number that we quoted is down too. Now we have almost 1,000 fewer primary school teachers than when he came to office. This is a First Minister whose promises on education are bogus, and the only thing more bogus than his pledges are his attempts to keep them. The First Minister put class sizes at the heart of his education policy. In recent years, secondary school rolls have fallen. That should make it easier to have smaller class sizes. Can the First Minister tell me, has the number of teachers fallen faster or more slowly than the drop in the number of pupils they have to teach?
First Minister.
Well, the agreement with COSLA in 2010 has been adhered to. It was 13.5 in 2011, 13.5 in 2012, 13.5 in 2013. Now, I read Joanne Lamont, and maybe we can get agreement on this point, the comparison between 2006 and primaries 1 to 3. 23.6 in 2006, now 23.2. Over primary as a whole, it was 23.2 in 2006 and is still 23.2. Now, I accept that's not the degree of improvement that we were looking for, but it is simply incorrect for Joanne Lamont to say that position has worsened since the Labour Party were in power in 2006, and perhaps she could acknowledge the point. Now, in terms of teacher numbers, I was struck by something that Larry Flanagan, the EIS General Secretary, said on Newsnight Scotland last night. He said one local authority is being responsible for the drop in teacher numbers. And I thought to myself, well, that can't possibly be true. How can one single local authority in the whole of this country to be responsible for the drop in teacher numbers of 175? So I've checked the figures, and it is a single local authority with a decline of 181 teachers between 2012 and 2013, responsible in that sense, as Larry Flanagan said, for the entire Scottish reduction of 175. Now, which is that single local authority? It's Glasgow City Council. So perhaps Joanne Lamont doesn't come along here and challenge the SNP government on teacher numbers. Why doesn't she take a trip to the city chambers and speak to her own colleagues?
Joanne Lamont. Order. Ms Lamont.
I hope the First Minister was watching Newsnight last night when his Education Secretary made the astonishing defence that up was down, that good was bad, that better was worse. He lives in a fantasy world, and I would suggest the First Minister stops listening to his Education Minister and look at what's happening on the ground. And if you want to look at what councils are doing, look at Dundee City Council. Last time I looked, I think it was an SNP administration. The number of pupils in primary 1 to 3 in classes of fewer than 18 has gone down in 1 year by 2/3. That tells us this is not a problem for individual councils, it's a problem for his government. And it's about time. It's about time. It's about time, instead of getting the civil servants to find some bizarre defence can get from these figures, some bizarre defence, that he got his government to confront what is happening in the real world to real families. Because there are now almost 3,000 fewer secondary school teachers than when he came to office. Almost 4,000 fewer teachers overall. Class sizes are going up, not down. And there's a pattern here, of course, and we've seen it in great form today. The First Minister makes a pledge, not on its own merits, but on how good a soundbite it makes. Then he hands the onus onto someone else, usually councils, and then he starves them of cash and blames them when they fail to meet the bogus pledge. He starves them of cash and blames them when they fail to meet the bogus pledge he tried to con the public with in the first place. Cynicism on stilts and not worthy of this Parliament at all. If we cannot trust, here's the question, if we
Order.
The children are obviously not away to the pantomime today.
Order.
If we cannot trust the First Minister on his key pledge in his 2007 manifesto, if somehow Scotland does vote yes next year, who is he going to blame when we find out his white paper isn't worth the mouse pad it was Googled on?
First Minister.
I think Joanne Lamont should look behind her for that particular punchline, which was pretty bad. They starved of cash. Starved of cash. Said Joanne Lamont. Yes, of course, there's been a starvation of cash. That's the starvation of Westminster austerity bearing down upon the Scottish people. Of course, the suggestion of Joanne Lamont was that this was the local authorities being starved of cash. Unfortunately, during 2006-07, when she was a minister, the local government share of Scottish government expenditure plus non-domestic rates income was 34.7%. It's now 36.8%. Of course, there's a squeeze on spending, but local government is doing better than the general public expenditure. Yes, there's been a starvation of cash. That's been a starvation of cash with her government and the government she now is allied with in the Bitter Together campaign in terms of what's been allowed for the Scottish people. Now, Joanne Lamont says that there's been the Dundee Council. They've got the second best teacher ratio in Scotland. That is not the situation that we have in Glasgow, where Glasgow now has moved above the agreement with COSLA in terms of the ratio of teachers to pupils. Now, she says it's a complex point. It's not a complex point at all. There's been a decline, which I regret, of 175 in overall teacher numbers in terms of the year to September 2013. 175. There's been a decline of 181 in the City of Glasgow. That means the City of Glasgow, as Larry Flanagan indicated last night, is a single local authority is responsible for that whole decline that we have seen in Scotland over the last year. So I do really think that she should go along and speak to her colleagues in Glasgow City Council. It would be refreshing, given they employ teachers in Scotland, if she would do that and accept her party's burden of responsibility in these matters. Now, where we have had success in terms of the legislation that was brought in, if we remember, to stop the class sizes in primary one of being more than 25. In 2006, there were 16,845 primary one pupils in class sizes of more than 25. It's now 580. I think in anybody's terms that would be seen as a reasonable improvement. That is a success, jointly for the government and the local authorities who have responded to that legislation. But let's talk about the success just for a second of pupils and teachers in Scottish schools. We have had record examination results, a substantial achievement of teachers and pupils. We've got record numbers of school leavers in positive destinations in Scotland, 89.5%. That is a substantial achievement of the teachers and the education system of Scotland. And we now know that in the PISA survey, the attainment gap in maths, reading and science between the most disadvantaged and the most advantaged areas of this country has closed and narrowed for the first time. Again, far more distance to travel, but nonetheless a substantial achievement. So instead of taking the view that Glasgow is not responsible for its own decline in teacher numbers, despite the fact it is responsible for the entire decline in Scotland this year, despite the fact of refusing to go along to the City Chambers, at least can we agree that in these difficult economic circumstances, the teachers and pupils of Scotland have turned in a substantial and first-class performance.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he will next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
No plans near future.
Ruth Davidson.
Thank you. 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister of Spain stated that an independent Scotland would join the same queue as everybody else to get into the EU, echoing the words of the Commission President and the Foreign Ministers of Spain, Ireland, Latvia and the Czech Republic. The First Minister told this chamber that every one of those people were wrong, and he selectively quoted a letter he found on the internet to back up his case. But the official position of the Commission had already been given to this Parliament when he stood up, in a letter dated the 5th of November and held by the Parliament's Information Service. Would the First Minister tell the Chamber why he chose to Google a pro-independence website rather than read from the official letter given to Parliament, and will he read from that letter now?
Well, the letter that I quoted from was absolutely genuine and was from the Commission. There was no difficulty about that. She just cited the Foreign Minister of Ireland as being the Foreign Minister of Ireland supported the position of Nicola Sturgeon and is on the record of saying that. And that position, let me repeat it, is in the 18-month period between the referendum of next year and Scotland becoming an independent nation in 2016. We'll negotiate our position from within the European Union. Is that 18-month period a satisfactory time in which to negotiate that position? Well, I think it's perfectly reasonable. Not the quotation of myself or the European Commission, but the quotation of Professor James Crawford, the legal expert employed by the United Kingdom Government to put forward the case. And when James Crawford looked at that period and said in response to that answer that was a reasonable timescale, I think basically that particular argument was removed from the Unionist Party's scaremongering menu.
Ruth Davidson.
I think the First Minister has inadvertently misquoted the Irish Foreign Minister there, so let me quote her directly. If Scotland were to become independent, Scotland would have to apply for membership, and that can be a lengthy process. But he did that as a diversionary tactic because he didn't want to quote from the letter in Spice, but I will. The EU is founded on treaties which apply only to the member states who have agreed and ratified them. A new independent state would, by the fact of its independence, become a third country with respect to the EU, and the treaties would no longer apply on its territory. And it goes on. It is unambiguous. An independent Scotland would have to negotiate entry into the European Union from the outside. The opt-outs that we currently have from the euro, from Schengen, would be voided. Our budget rebate would no longer apply. So we have a First Minister who misled the people of Scotland once, telling them he had specific legal advice on Europe when none existed. He misled them a second time by trying to pretend a letter he'd Googled was the final word on European entry. And it turns out that he's misled them a third time, because an official position on EU entry had been given to this Parliament, and instead of detailing its contents, he used the internet letter instead. He is the Pinocchio of Scottish politics.
I'm
Every
sorry,
time
Miss
he
Davidson.
on Europe,
Miss Davidson.
Another inch.
Miss Davidson, sit down. I don't consider that language appropriate. Can you continue?
My apologies to you, Presiding Officer, if I have caused offence in this chamber. I will continue by saying that I have outlined 3 cases on a single issue in which the First Minister of this country has misled the people of this country. And, Presiding Officer, I will ask the First Minister, if the people of this country can't trust the First Minister on this issue, why should they trust him on any issue?
First Minister.
Well, the letter I read out from the Commission official has been confirmed as genuine. It was read out in good faith to this.
Order.
Well, the letter has been confirmed in genuine, not in the internet, but in the hard copy, which we now have. It is not the letter from the Irish Foreign Minister. Will be put in Spice, which I think when Ruth Davidson looks at it, she'll find supports, and I think it actually says in that letter, if I recall correctly, supports Nicola Sturgeon's position. And if we go back to the debate of only 2 weeks ago, I remember pointing out explicitly to Ruth Davidson that what the EU Commission had said, they would comment on a precise legal scenario, and they've repeated that many times. Now, why don't we have a precise legal scenario? Because the United Kingdom Government refused to go to the Commission with the precise legal scenario.
Order.
Yes, I know she's getting exercised by this, but that is the case. The United Kingdom Government have refused repeatedly to go to the European Commission with that precise legal scenario, despite the offer of the Scottish Government to do so. Now, why might that be? Why might that be? Just as why the Spanish Prime Minister says the cases of Catalonia and Scotland are totally different, refuses to say that he would veto an independent Scotland's membership, despite Joanne Lamont's confident assertion of that only 2 weeks. Because it is known and recognised that when Professor James Crawford said that was a reasonable timescale to negotiate Scotland's position from within the European Union by definition, then he knew what he was talking about. Why is it a reasonable timescale? Because we're part of of the acquis communautaire will be negotiating a position having conformed to European regulations. That is why, having been a part of the European Union for 40 years, is not the same circumstances in negotiations as being an accession state. So in the time that Ruth Davidson can go to her Prime Minister and ask him to agree to the Scottish Government's suggestion to go to the European Commission with the precise legal scenario, then perhaps she can come back, revise her view and stop putting forward the incredible suggestion that resource-rich, people-rich, fish-rich Scotland would not be welcome in the European Union. One further point about that timescale.
First Minister, if I could get
of negotiations is likely to be more successful. Is it the UK Government negotiating its way out, or the Scottish
First Minister? First Minister, when I address you directly, I'd appreciate if you'd resume your seat. I was trying to say that I wanted you to come to a conclusion. Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
To ask the First Minister what issues will be discussed at the next meeting of the Cabinet.
First Minister.
Issues of importance to the people of Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
I can tell the First Minister that I was genuinely pleased that nursery education has secured such a prominent place in his White Paper. It is good that we can agree that nursery education is a priority, even though he and I will disagree about the best constitutional arrangement to deliver it. However, he says his new plan can only be delivered with independence, whereas I want to take the first steps now for 2-year-olds. Can we not put aside our differences on the Constitution to do it? The commitment in the White Paper is now combined with extra funds from Westminster. It means he can act in next year's budget. Will he consider putting extra support for 2-year-olds in that budget?
First Minister.
Well, let me try to reach the point of consensus that Willie Rennie asked for. Yes, I agree childcare is a fundamental priority. And I agree that Willie Rennie has pursued this issue many times in this chamber. What I don't agree is 2 things. One, I don't agree with his interpretation of what's actually happening south of the border at the present moment, and I can give him very substantive evidence for that. And secondly, I think that transformation in childcare pointed to in the White Paper requires, in terms of its funding, access to the revenues that will be generated by that substantial expansion of women coming into the workforce. Revenues which currently flow to the Westminster Exchequer under the current constitutional arrangements, and where I think, even if his colleague Danny Alexander wanted to give them to the Scottish Government, I think it's highly unlikely that the Chancellor would follow that example. So if we can agree that a transformation in childcare is the way forward in one of addressing inequality and female access to the workforce and the future of children in Scotland, then surely we can also agree that the benefits from that policy should flow into a Scottish Exchequer so that policy can be comprehensively funded.
Willie Rennie.
No one expects the First Minister to deliver full-time places from the age of 1 from next August. No one's saying that. Even his plan will take until 2024. Parents across Scotland, I have to say, will be mystified as to why he won't act now. On 2-year-olds, he has the power. He has the support across the chamber. His party policy backs it. And now he has the extra money. There is nothing on earth that should stop him delivering for 2-year-olds from next August. I am sorry to say that he's given a very good impression of a man imprisoned by his obsession with independence. The children should not lose out because we cannot agree on the Constitution. Can he at least confirm that new provision for 2-year-olds will be put on the table for talks between our parties in the budget?
Right, can we deal with the issues in turn? It's true, of course, as I've said, that the interpretation that Willie Rennie constantly puts on what's happening in England I don't think is borne out by the facts. And therefore, the UK Government press release on the 12th of November, which admitted that around 30% that's 38,000 of eligible 2-year-olds were not receiving their entitlement to 15 hours a week of free childcare, I think is pertinent to this particular debate, given that previously, when we argued about standards in childcare, it turned out to be the argument I put forward, along with his own party leader, which prevailed over his Tory partners in government. Now, in terms of the consequentials in the autumn statement, yes, it's true that I've got a quote from Danny Alexander himself on the 6th of December. He thinks we should spend these consequentials on increasing childcare. Unfortunately, in the same release, he also says we should spend them on free school meals, on helping business and on dualling the A9. Now, I know that the local government, the Liberal Democrats, have long believed in STV, but you cannot have a single transferable consequential when it comes to the allocating of government expenditure. Now, can I say what the difference is between that expansion, which I would like to see and which we notify in the first year of an independent Scotland in the White Paper, that substantial expansion costing £100 million, and what Willie Rennie's suggestion. We go on to explain how a real transformation in childcare, an expenditure of £700 million, will require to have access to the revenues generated by the women being released and freed to go back into the workforce. Now, when Willie Rennie agrees with me that we need both sides of the balance sheet, the revenues generated by Scotland to afford our joint interest in transforming childcare, then I think we can reach real agreement. But listen, the people of Scotland, knowing what independence can deliver, knowing that Joanne Lamont only last week described childcare as an independence issue, is going to be one of the defining issues of the independence referendum.
Question number 4, John Mason.
To ask the First Minister what the implications are of the autumn statement for Scotland's budget.
First Minister.
Well, I think it's quite clear that the austerity approach for the UK Government has let Scotland miss out on opportunities for growth. And let's remember that even under the better figures being released at the autumn statement, the UK economy remains smaller than it did prior to the recession. And despite the fact that Scotland has paid more per person in taxes every year for the last 30 years, when the rest of the UK, our spending power has been cut over the 5-year spending period in real terms by over £3 billion. It's therefore quite ludicrous, not just for Westminster Government, but for those in this chamber who support them, to suggest that the consequentials of perhaps £100 million in revenue terms can compensate for the withdrawal of £3,000 million plus from real Scottish spending as part of the austerity programme.
Make this brief, Mr Mason.
The First Minister will be aware of the hammer blow from the Conservative Lib Dem statement that the retirement age is to rise yet again, meaning that Scottish youngsters leaving school this year will have to work for more than 50 years to get the state pension, and it takes no account of Scotland's lower life expectancy. Can the First Minister indicate what Scotland's pension policy would be following a yes vote?
Briefly, First Minister.
In the White Paper, and of course it is pertinent to look at life expectancy in Scotland and the rest of the UK when deciding what the right retirement age is. That is one of the examples where Scotland's priorities can be met when Scotland controls all areas of revenue and spending.
Question 5, Mr Findlay.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's position is on whether the number of hours worked by junior doctors is acceptable.
The Government is monitoring in place to ensure that junior doctor rotas comply fully with the working time regulations, and junior doctors work no more than 48 hours per week on average. And we continue our work with NHS boards and professional bodies to review best practice and how this can be used to improve the working lives of junior doctors.
Briefly, Mr Findlay.
Presiding Officer, 2 years ago, junior doctor Lauren Conley tragically died in a car crash on her way home from hospital. Lauren had just finished 4 days of straight day shifts and the first night of a 7-day run of night shifts. In the weeks prior to the accident, Lauren had been rostered to work up to 107 hours. She, like many other junior doctors, routinely worked in excess of these hours. Lauren's father is not looking for someone to blame or scapegoat. He just wants to ensure that no other junior doctor has the same experience as Lauren and no one else suffers the grief and misery that his family have suffered. Will the First Minister agree to meet with Brian Conley and me to look at ways in which we can bring about the change needed to avoid a repeat of this very sad situation?
Well, I express obviously my condolences to Dr Connolly's friends and family. I cannot comment specifically on this case because it still could be subject to a fatal accident inquiry, as I understand the position. It's still under investigation and it may result in a fatal accident inquiry, and I cannot comment on an individual case on that basis. But I want to stress the condolences I know everybody in this chamber has to Dr Connolly and the family of the junior doctor. Can I say that I'd be happy to arrange such a meeting? It has to be that we can't comment on the circumstances exactly of the crash. That is the rules. But nonetheless, I'd be happy to arrange the meeting. I do think, however, we need to recognise that while, of course, the constant monitoring discussions with the BMA should take place to see if further improvements can be made, the average hours per week of junior doctors has reduced from 58 hours in 2004 to up to 48 hours today. And it's also the case that we have twice-yearly monitoring. We have twice-yearly monitoring to make certain that these rules are being applied to. So yes, of course, as we do with the BMA, we're perfectly happy to have meetings to discuss how further improvements can be made. But let's recognise that over the piece there has been progress made, and let's hope that further progress can be made.
Question 6, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's position is on recent reports that shoppers in an independent Scotland could face higher food bills.
First Minister.
Well, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to expect the retail prices in Scotland to be higher than they are at the present moment. Far from food prices rising because of independence, the truth of the matter is they're rising within the UK at the present moment. The latest OECD stats on food price rises for the year to October showed food prices within the UK are the 4th highest in the OECD, with our small independent European neighbours experiencing lower price rises, in some cases falling prices. I also welcome, of course, that the supermarkets have clarified their position, and another fairly obvious or ridiculous scaremongering attempt by the Better Together campaign has fallen apart in the last few days.
Stuart McMillan, briefly please, Mr McMillan.
Thank you. I thank the First Minister for that response. Does the First Minister agree that the No campaign's reaction to the story is just a lot of nonsense, and also it does actually fall apart when it is subject to any scrutiny from any politician, also within the public of Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, I hear the Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party saying they've said nothing on the issue in the No campaign. The No campaign did react on the first day when they saw the opportunity to have another scaremongering campaign. I agree they've been pretty quiet since the story has totally fallen apart in terms of the reaction of the supermarkets. But I recall that the leaflets about the UK's AAA credit rating, which were never withdrawn. I recall, of course, that Doctor Who couldn't be broadcast in Scotland, despite the fact that 90 countries worldwide were enjoying it. My personal favourite from the Labour Party, they would have to drive on the other side of the road in an independent Scotland. And, of course, the corker, distance from him by the Deputy Leader of the Conservatives, distance, I admit, that roaming charges would go up in an independent Scotland on the very day the European Commission were putting forward their total abolition.
Before we end First Minister's question, I've got... sit down, Mr Finlay, I'm speaking. Before we end First Minister's question, there is something I want to say. And that is, I consider 27 minutes to get through the three leaders' questions and exchanges is far too long. When I became the presiding officer, I said that I wanted to be fair to backbenchers. It is hardly fair to backbenchers that they have got precisely 3 minutes to ask their questions. I have spoken privately to the business managers on many occasions, asking this to be brought to the attention of the leaders. I'm going to look very carefully next week because, quite frankly, I consider it unacceptable and I'm not putting up with it in the future. Mr Finlay, you've got a point of order.
Presiding Officer, in the response to the First Minister's reply on my question, I am absolutely sure the First Minister did not seek to deliberately mislead Parliament. But in the case that I mentioned, it is my understanding, having spoken to the family, that no fatal accident inquiry will occur in this case. So maybe I could invite the Presiding Officer, through you, Presiding Officer, the First Minister, to return to the Chamber at some point to correct the record.
I don't think it's a point of order. First Minister.
To return to the Chamber, and it certainly should not be a political issue. I was quoting from the notes I have here, which says the acting is still under investigation. This may result in an FAI. But what I'll do with Mr Findlay, because it shouldn't be, it absolutely should not be a political issue, is I'll have that point clarified and make sure that information is relayed to the family. If there is any misunderstanding, then it can be properly cleared up in that fashion.
We now move to members' business. I'm going to allow a very short pause to allow members who are not participating to leave the chamber and for public gallery to clear before we move to